Hi, everybody. So this video is about imperialism in the 19th century. These are the questions that I would like you to consider as you watch the video. The first, what is an empire and what is its purpose? What is imperialism? What was new about 19th century imperialism? How did industrialization lead to increasing imperialism? And finally, what cultural factors helped lead to increased imperialism? The key terms that you should be able to define by the end of the video are imperialism, and that includes old imperialism and new imperialism, colonialism, protectorate, spheres of influence, social Darwinism, markets, and raw materials. So I want to start off this video by defining the terms imperialism and colonialism so that you can understand the difference between the two. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. So what colonialism has that imperialism doesn't necessarily have is the settlement of one country in another territory. Now, both colonialism and imperialism deal with what happens when a country pursues the goal of establishing, expanding, or maintaining an empire. And that leads us to the question, well, what is an empire? And in this context, an empire is a political entity in which a single dominant region uses its power to control a number of other regions with the goal of further strengthening the dominant region. So there are 3 rules for building an imperial empire. If you want to build an empire, this is what you would do. 1, you use your power to conquer a weaker territory. So you go over and you take over a weak neighbor, maybe on the other side of the ocean. Second, you take stuff from the conquered territories. This could be tax money, it could be natural resources, or it could even be people. 3, you use the stuff you take to increase your control of these conquered territories, or you go on to conquer more territories that you can take control of. So now that you have a basic understanding of the definition of imperialism, I want you to be aware that not all imperialism looks exactly the same. There are 3 major types of imperialism. The first is a colony. That is a country or territory that is governed by a foreign power. Basically, it's an area under the complete control of another country, and settlers from the mother country come to the colony to live. The second is a sphere of influence. That's an area in which an outside power or country has the ability to affect developments, although it has no formal authority. It's basically a region where one country dominates trade with that area, but that area doesn't officially belong to the mother country. The third type of imperialism is a protectorate. This is a country or territory with its own local government, but that local government is under the control of a greater outside power. It's basically a country that is independent or sovereign, but under the protection of the mother country. By the 19th century, imperialism had been around for a few hundred years, but beginning in the 1800s, imperialism began to be enacted in a different way. So from the 19th century on, we can refer to this as new imperialism. Old imperialism lasted between the 16th and 18th centuries, or the 1500s through the 1700s. In old imperialism, European powers didn't usually acquire territory in Africa and Asia. Rather, they built a series of trading stations. So, for example, Portugal established a series of trading posts along the west coast of Africa, India, and Indonesia. And in the 16th century, it dominated the spice trade before losing ground to the Netherlands in the 17th century. In addition to not acquiring territory, old imperialism can also be characterized by the relationship between Europeans and local rulers. Europeans in Asia respected and frequently cooperated with local rulers in India, China, Japan, Indonesia, and other areas where trade flourished between locals and European coastal trading centers. Now, there's always exceptions that prove the rule. So the New World was this exception. Spain had established an enormous empire in Central and South America, and Portugal established Brazil as a sugar colony. England colonized the east coast of North America, and France established New France in modern-day Canada. In these New World territorial acquisitions, indigenous nations in Mesoamerica and South America were severely subjugated. This brings us to 19th century imperialism, or New Imperialism. Starting in roughly 1850 and going up to 1914, which was the start of the First World War, the industrializing nations of the world were able to incorporate much of the rest of the world into these huge global empires. And there were a couple of major players and then a couple more minor players that you should know about. The major players in this were Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the United States. These were the big, powerful, industrializing regions of the world that were then able to go out and build these huge empires all over the world. There were also some smaller powers. These were lesser industrializing nations, and this included places like Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and the Netherlands. Now, this era of new imperialism starts out in the early 1800s with Europeans controlling about 7% of the world's territory. But by the end of the era of new imperialism in 1914, Europeans controlled 84% of the world's territory. Now, the distinguishing characteristic between new imperialism and old imperialism is that new imperialism is way more wide-reaching and more intense than earlier versions of imperialism. In old imperialism, earlier empires tended to be regional or depended on strategically located trading posts, while 19th century empires spanned continents and crossed oceans. The way that Europeans were able to colonize places like Africa and Asia was by using military force to take control of local governments, exploiting local economies for raw materials that were required by Europe's growing industry, and imposing Western values to benefit these quote-unquote backwards colonies. So now a good question to ask is, why does this new type of imperialism happen? And a major cause of this new wave of imperialism is industrialization. So we can get a hint that this is the case from the fact that all of the major empires of the 19th century were centered on industrializing nations. So an industrial nation always stood at the core of these new global empires. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, industrialization makes it easier to set up an empire because it makes a nation more powerful. And remember, the first step in setting up an empire is using your power to take over somebody else. So if you become more powerful, there are going to be more opportunities for imperialism. Now, industrialization makes a country more powerful in a number of ways, but basically you get more people because of more efficient agriculture, and you get better technology, things like steamships, machine guns, advanced medicines, and you also just get more stuff because you're using machines to create stuff, and you're using steam power to make those machines. So there's better stuff, there's more stuff, and there's more people to use this stuff. Another reason that industrialization leads to empire is that industry demands natural resources. Basically, for all of the stuff that you're getting out of your factories, you need stuff to put into your factories. And this means that you're going to need more and more stuff as industrialization continues. Think about how tiny England is. It's a tiny little island, but if it's going to keep growing, it's going to need to bring back new resources from outside of its borders. It's going to need to bring in things like cotton to make cloth or rare metals to make more advanced machines and stuff like that. So eventually, industrializing nations are going to have to look to other places to get this type of stuff, all of these new raw materials. So, what industrializing nations do to secure these types of imports for important resources is they set up colonies in order to secure these resources, and then they can import them into their countries. So, imperialism is a way for industrial nations to bring in the natural resources that they need. Now, these industrial nations also need markets or places to sell their products. As industrialization goes on, countries are making more and more stuff. But for all of the new things that you're making, you also need more people to sell them to. And because there's only a limited number of people in any given country, at a certain point, you're going to need to start selling to other types of people. So in the second half of the 19th century, industrialized nations started to claim other areas and began to sell their stuff in those areas. Another cause of imperialism in the 19th century was the development of a lot of different cultural ideas. And one of the most disturbing cultural ideas that led to imperialism was this belief in industrialized nations that they were culturally and racially superior to those who did not live in industrialized nations. Industrialized countries tended to think that they were more advanced than non-industrialized regions. And technologically, this was true. They did have advanced technology, but they also started to think that they were more advanced as people genetically. And they used this idea to argue that it was okay to conquer these other regions. Because they were more advanced, they had the duty to take over the less advanced parts of the world and to raise up the less advanced peoples to civilization. So this was an idea that made it seem okay that Europe and America were taking over the rest of the world. There were also widespread racist views that were backed up by pseudoscientific ideas that argued that Europeans were destined to rule the world because they were, quote, the most advanced race. Some scientists even use Darwin's new theory on evolution, the survival of the fittest ideology, to argue that Europeans were more highly evolved than other races, and that because of this, it was only natural that Europeans would go on to dominate the world. This was because of things like natural selection. This, of course, has nothing to do with Darwin's theories, but the idea was very popular back in the imperial time. Finally, the idea of national competition also leads to the spread of imperialism. Basically, different industrial countries were racing to claim as much land as possible because they were worried that other nations would claim it if they didn't get to it first. As a result, new military and naval bases were created to protect a country's imperial interests against other European powers. And this national competition leads to increased tensions between the haves, for example, places like the British Empire that had colonies on basically every continent, and the have-nots, places like Germany, who came in late to imperialistic competition. So now that we've reached the end of the video, the key takeaways that you should have are: 1, a variety of motives and methods led to the intensification of European global control and increased tensions among the great powers. 2, European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations in their new imperial ventures in Africa and Asia. And 3, industrial and technological developments facilitated European control of global empires.